Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Boston College Law School. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Vincent Rougeau. I'm the Dean, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this program, Civic Engagement in an Equality Recession. And before we get started, I'd like to thank a few people who helped make this program possible. First of all, it was conceived and all the hard legwork was done primarily by our Balsa students, and I'd like to thank two of them in particular, Alvin Reynolds and Taisha Sturdivant, who did an incredible job. And I'd also like to thank one of our co-sponsors, which is the Jesuit Institute. And I think we have Father Jim Keenan, who's here, the director of the Jesuit Institute and professor of theology. So thank you for your support. I'd also like to recognize the university provost, David Quigley, who's sitting next to Father King. And thank you, David, for joining us. Now, a lot of the advertising for the program mentioned that Professor Charles Ogletree from Harvard Law School would be with us today. Unfortunately, there was a death in his family, and he's unable to join us. So we send our prayers and best wishes to the Ogletree family, and he wanted to make sure that I mentioned that he was deeply sorry for his inability to attend. I promised, though, without him, we will still have a wonderful, wonderful program. But I just wanted to mention that on his behalf. So I'd like to get us started. And first of all, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for being here. But I will introduce our wonderful moderator, and she'll introduce our panelists after that. So please let me introduce Susan Mays Rothstein, our moderator. Susan's a graduate of Boston College Law School, a former president of the school's Black Alumni Network, and a professor at Northeastern University, where she manages the community social justice projects in Northeastern's first-year program. Prior to teaching, she served over 10 years as an administrative law judge at the Department of Industrial Accidents. So I'd like to thank Susan for being with us, but I also like to put in a personal plug. I've worked very closely with Susan since my arrival here at Boston College Law School. And yes, she's an alumna, but she's just an incredible, incredible supporter of this school on so many different levels. She really works hard in so many ways, and this is just one of many. So it's really a great personal pleasure for me to be able to hand the mic over to Susan Mays Rothstein, our moderator. Thanks.
Thank you, Dean, for that kind and warm welcome. I'm just the referee, really. I'm delighted to be here, and there is some other significance to my being here, and that is because the Boston College Law School Black Alumni Network this year is celebrating their 30th anniversary of existence in the law school. And so we take great pride in that. This happens to also be the 50th anniversary year of the Civil Rights Act and Civil Rights Movement. And, you know, it's not a small feat that Boston College Law School has actually supported and sustained a Black Alumni Network for 30 of those 50 years. And so we see that as a part of BC's great contribution to the civil rights movement, because each graduate of color who leaves this school and enters practice is actually fulfilling some of that promise for the civil rights movement. And so in large and small ways, every single day, we are creating the civil rights movement. And we're here today to talk about that in some depth, actually. Our focus today is the equality recession. And first, I'd like to start by giving you a couple words on format for today's discussion. We will ask each panelist to speak. This concept was brought together because of the milestones of Brown versus Board of Education and the Voting Rights Act that have furthered race relations in the United States. And this is sort of a checking in on where we are right now with regard to the hopes and aspirations of those laws and efforts, and then what ought we do as a result of that. So each of our wonderful panelists, who I will introduce to you momentarily, will be speaking for about 10 to 15 minutes. From there, we will have a hubbub among the panelists where we just sort of chat. And then from there, we're going to open up the floor to what we hope will be a robust question and answer section from everybody who has taken the time out of their day to sit here with us and join us in this thought process. So the press release for this particular event had a couple of very cool things to say, so thank you to the authors. I think the two of you are sitting right there. But Ferguson, voting rights, income disparities, the education gaps, the opportunity gaps, the school-to-prison pipeline. These are all of the sort of central topics of our day that call into question what it was that we set up and what it has resulted in, and how far have we actually gotten. Recession, of course, refers to society's advancements and then significant reductions once a peak has been reached, just as a recession in an economy. So, without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. We have with us today Catherine Wells, professor at Boston College Law School. Professor Wells teaches and writes in various areas of legal theory, including pragmatic legal theory, feminist jurisprudence, and civil rights theory. Professor Wells has held many positions in the academic community and has served as the Associate Dean of Academic Affairs here at BC. So welcome, Professor Wells. Darnell Williams, sitting right next to her. He's the black guy in the middle. Is a well-respected community leader and is the president and CEO of the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts, a nonprofit organization that provides programs in education, career, and professional development and employment for African Americans and other residents of color. Mr. Williams is well known to and often assists in other culturally diverse organizations. Prior to joining the Urban League, Mr. Williams was a manager of recruitment and management and development. Sorry about that, I think I've just trampled all over that. At the Massachusetts General Hospital. He was also appointed by Governor Deval Patrick to the board of directors at the MBTA. No throwing things.
You're on a roll.
So we welcome Mr. Williams on our panel. Thank you. And finally, we have with us Tom Shapiro, a Puckross professor of law and social policy and director at the Institute on Assets and Social Policy at Brandeis University. Professor Shapiro has a particular focus on closing the racial wealth gap and the hidden cost of being African American and how wealth perpetuates inequality, a book that was published in 2004. He and another colleague, Dr. Oliver, wrote the award-winning Black Wealth, White Wealth, which received the 1997 Distinguished Scholarly Publication Award from the American Sociological Association. So we welcome Professor Shapiro. Okay, let's begin.
Okay, I too want to thank Ty and Alvin and all of you for coming today. It's important to keep conversations going about race. So I'm going to begin by stating the obvious, which is that I'm white. In thinking about today's talk, I thought I want to talk to other white people about race, specifically to all of you who are in your own lives committed to the idea of social justice. And I know that there are a lot of you here today, because I know many of you. And I assume you didn't come to a talk on an equality recession so that you could sell it short. So in this talk, I'm not going to use the term racism. And I'm not going to use it because it causes some confusion among white people. For an African American, the meaning of racism is clear. It refers to all of the obstacles, big and small, that impede their progress in the world, that are there because of their race. For whites, the big and small aspect of it creates a problem. I don't want my unintentionally insensitive remarks lumped in with the fraternity in Oklahoma, or even worse, with the beating of demonstrators at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. But there's even a more fundamental problem with whites' understanding of racism. Racism has suggested to us that what whites need to do is to simply avoid racist acts. Worse, that if we do nothing about race, in fact, if we don't even notice it, then we'll be okay. And that's not the case. I would put the question this way, and this is the question I want to talk about. Do we have a responsibility for the fact, do we as white people have a responsibility for the fact that we enjoy so much white privilege? If so, how do we go about discharging that responsibility? So I thought I'd begin with a story. One day not too long ago, I said to an African American friend of mine that I had not known any African Americans at all until I went to college. Why was that, she asked. I grew up in a small town, I answered, a sleepy New England town, where there was only one African American family, and they kept pretty much to themselves. And why weren't there any blacks in your town, she asked. I don't know, I answered. I guess it was a long way from the South, and it wasn't exactly an exciting place to live. No, she said, you should read a book called Sundown Towns. Little New England towns like yours had ordinances prohibiting blacks from being in town after sundown. But, I said, we did have one black family. Read the book, she said, and so I did. I couldn't believe it. As former slaves migrated from the South, there was a particularly violent northern reaction. Towns passed ordinances, developers inserted restricted covenants into their deeds. There were signs that said, no African Americans after sundown, but they weren't that polite. There were arrests and lynchings. Black families who had lived in the town for many years found their houses burned down. The only exception, and I'm afraid this accounts for the one black family in my town, were for those who worked as servants in white households. All of this didn't stop until the Civil Rights Movement. Not knowing this, I had assumed the lack of color in my town was natural, that it was the result of natural forces. Perhaps African Americans didn't want to live there. My point in this story is twofold. First, I think it's hard for us to think about the nature of our responsibility if we are ignorant about why things are the way they are. Secondly, we need to look at our own communities. It's easy to condemn the jerks in Oklahoma and their vicious and racist songs, but it's much harder to think about things here at home. And so that's what I want to do today. I'm going to talk about Boston College Law School. And nobody should imagine that I am accusing our beloved law school of being racist. I am not. And in fact, this is one of the few law schools in the country where I'd really feel safe saying some of the things I'm going to say. So here we are. We know that African American students are underrepresented in our student body. They're also underrepresented on our faculty, but I'll save that for another day. Today I want to talk about students. And most of us believe the fact that African Americans are underrepresented on our student body is not a good thing. And even worse, we live in a time in which a huge percentage of black men are being incarcerated, primarily for drug crimes, but primarily because there is differential enforcement. And there's a crying need for lawyers who will represent them, not just black lawyers, but white lawyers who are qualified to represent this population. I don't think at any time in my memory has the need for black lawyers and for white lawyers who will do this kind of work been quite so crucial. And yet, black lawyers are underrepresented in our student body. Now, here's the question. Why aren't there any more black students here? Why don't we have a proportional number of black students here? We certainly recruit. We conduct affirmative action, although we don't like to say so. We write notes to the black students we admit. Our black students have been wonderful in reaching out to black students and getting them to come. Nevertheless, like virtually every other law school, black students are underrepresented at the school. Well, the answer to this question is not really a mystery. I think anybody who's ever served on an admissions committee could tell you that the chief reason why black students are underrepresented is the LSAT. We require students who apply to take the LSAT. We, in essence, have a minimum score that you must make in order to be admitted. And one of the major goals of our admissions process is to admit a class with the highest possible numbers. And we do this because we want to be well ranked. So many people say, I mean, this is something you'll hear when you hear law teachers talk, that the problem here is that there's a lack of qualified applicants, right? And the big assumption here is that a high number on the LSAT score is equivalent to qualification for law school and to practice law. And to some extent, most people believe this. It's stated fairly often when you hear people talking about admissions. Employers seem to believe the higher your numbers, the better you are. And the Supreme Court has said that. From Bakke on down, the theory is that the numbers represent merit. And if you deviate from merit, that is, you deviate from the numbers, you should be eyed suspiciously and struck down if your deviation is based on race. But I think, like with lawyers, we need to question this assumption. We need to question whether or not the LSAT has anything to do with merit, whether it has anything to do with your qualification to practice law. So I'm not going to bore you with all the technical details about the test. What I have done is assembled some facts that I think will help you understand what the problem really is. Let's see if we get it. Okay, so I have the screens down because there are a few pictures that I couldn't really reproduce without having the screens down. So let me begin with the first fact. The LSAT, like all standardized tests, results in significantly lower scores for African Americans. And when I say significant, I mean significant. In general, the difference for all standardized tests is 1.5 standard deviations. That's a lot. For the LSAT, it's only 1.0 standard deviation. And indeed, the Law School Admission Council congratulates themselves on having a lower deviation, not thinking that perhaps the people who take the test are self-selected. Secondly, standardized tests, intelligence tests, have a long and somewhat doubtful history. You might want to read a book called The Mismeasure of Man by Stephen Gould. In that book, he talks about this long and storied history, and some of the examples I'm going to give you come from that book. The first widely administered intelligence test was given to soldiers during the First World War. It was called the Army Mental Test. So that is the first test. Oh, we don't have the lights on. Okay. All right, so here's the Army Mental Test. So here is the result. These were the first widespread IQ tests given. They were given to soldiers who were in the camps prior to World War I, and they were widely advertised, and particularly advertised for the results that I've put on the board here. First of all, the average mental age of all test takers was 13. And this was somewhat surprising because the psychological science at the time deemed you a, quote, moron if your mental age was less than 12. So here we are, our average is skating precariously close to a nation of imbeciles, a phrase you are all familiar with. The second result from these tests was that fair, and this is how they described them, fair Northern Europeans scored significantly higher than darker Southern Europeans and Eastern European Slavs. And finally, confirming the test givers' expectations, it was clear this was their expectation. American Negroes, that's their word, scored the lowest with an average mental age of 10.4. All right, so this was the first widespread IQ test. The results of it were widely publicized and taken to prove these things. Now, they might have been disturbed by the fact that the average was so close to the moron level, but they said that the reason for that was that they were only testing enlisted men, they weren't testing officers. So, and also the people who didn't have to go to war because their jobs at home required them to stay there for the war effort. So that was why the average age was only 13. But in any case, the poor Eastern Europeans and the poor Southern Europeans and the Negroes were all considered to be of ages that were below the imbecile level. Anyway, now, in order to understand what this test comes to, I want you to look at some of the questions. Now, they were very concerned. Many of the immigrants that served in the armed forces during the war were not able to read. So they were picture tests. And what you had to do was you had to draw in the picture and complete it. And if you got a right answer, then that would score. Well, let me show you one of the questions. Here's question number one. Imagine yourself a darker Southern European looking at this picture. And you have to draw in the missing thing. It might help if you were Italian and played bocce, but you can see that you have to know a great deal more about this picture in order to know what's missing. The next one is even worse. What's missing here? Well, unless you played tennis and knew that you needed a net, you wouldn't necessarily know the answer to that question. Here's another one. What's missing here? Okay, so, yeah, I mean, lots of cultures have cards, but they don't all have cards that have jacks on them. They don't all have cards that have one on one corner and one on the other. So that was another test. And finally, here's one that all of you are going to get wrong, but I'll get right because I'm old. Let's see. Here it is. Okay, so what's missing in this one? Some of you are looking, what's that? It's a phonograph. And what's missing is the horn, which was the early speakers for a phonograph. So if you drew a horn in here, you would get credit, all right? You're getting the point, I think. One of the things that we have to recognize about these tests is that it is very difficult to separate out intelligence from the cultural assumptions of the people who are giving the test. So that all of these efforts at having so-called objective standardized tests involve to some degree this problem. We may have gotten better at it. Maybe we don't look for tennis nets, but in any case, a lot of the questions do have this problem. So then the people who professionally give tests made an effort during the 1960s and 70s to correct this problem. That is, they hired panels of experts, that is consultants, who were people of color and women, to write questions that would relate to the background of women and people of color, right? So they hired these experts. And here, I'm going to give you an example of one of the questions that they wrote. This is one of my favorite. All right, so this is in a test to see just how good your English is. The instruction says that you should make a correction if necessary, but if the sentence is right under any interpretation, D would be the correct answer. So the question says, Mary took a karate course to protect herself from a qualified instructor. And then there are 4 choices. And let me ask you, which answer is right? C? That's what the people who gave the test thought. Anybody see a different possible answer here? I'm sorry, D is not what they thought. You gave the right, what I think is the right answer. C was the answer they thought was right. Because Mary couldn't possibly be protecting herself from an instructor. Right? Well, I think most of the women who took the test knew that Mary might well be protecting herself from an instructor. And so what happened to this question was that one of the things they do with these questions is they give them in a test section. When you took the LSAT, you all had a section of questions that were ones they were testing to see if they were any good. And a question's good if it does 2 things. First of all, it has to be hard enough so that some people don't get it right. And then secondly, it has to do what they actually call discriminate. And a question discriminates properly if the people who do well on the test get the question right and the people who don't do well on the test get the question wrong. So if, for example, and this was the case with this question, the people who took the test and usually did well on the test, that is the people from the dominant social class and so forth, the white people and the men, actually they thought that the answer was C, and so the answer became C. All right, so even these efforts to make the test work don't seem to work very well. And there's a lot more about this that we could go into, but I don't want to test your attentiveness to technical detail. In any case, the problem is that these tests are not able very well to sort out the things that don't matter, like background and so forth. Now, you should know that if the Law School Admissions Council were here, they would tell you not to worry about the racial disparity in the test. And the reason why you don't need to worry about it is because it's accurate. That is, it accurately pinpoints first-year grades. That's not quite right. It, together with your undergraduate grade point average, have a significant correlation to first-year grades. That's what is really true. And so then you have to ask yourself, if you're in your law student, let's question all the assumptions mode, you have to ask yourself, well, is there any bias in first-year grades? Are there any reasons why grades don't necessarily reflect people's ability to be a lawyer, or at least first-year grades don't? And shouldn't we be looking at that? As a law school, shouldn't we be considering whether or not our first-year grades accurately reflect what it is that lawyers have to do? And I think, at least on a superficial level, the answer to that has to be no. There are so many skills that lawyers need that first-year grades have nothing to do with. They have nothing to do with good judgment. They have nothing to do with communication skills except this highly stylized version of legal writing that we have. There are all kinds of things that good lawyers need to do and need to do routinely that first-year grades don't capture. So what we have is sort of a rotating series of gatehouses that are keeping out some of the students that we desperately want to have and are keeping them out for reasons that we at least aren't clear about. And that seems to me to be something that really deserves our attention. So I made these 5 points about the law school admission test for a number of reasons. First of all, I do want you all to seriously consider that we shouldn't be using the LSATs the way in which we do. Second, I want to make a point about affirmative action. The Supreme Court talks about affirmative action being justified because it gives the black population a time to, quote, catch up with whites. Maybe it's just the opposite. Maybe it is us white people who need time to figure out why our seemingly inclusive culture is really excluding people of color. And this brings me to my final point. I began by pointing out that being responsible requires that we learn more about our racial history and how it constructs our modern world. When we think of abandoning the LSATs and even, oh God forbid, dropping out of the US news process, we are talking about very big changes. And this really is my point. Responsibility for racism requires courage. It requires us to challenge settled ways, to keep our eyes on the prize, and to know that the prize is not moving up in the rankings, but living in communities that are inclusive and respectful to all.
Good evening, or afternoon still. To Alvin and Taisha, to Dean Rougeau, to the administration officials that are here present, to my fellow panelists, and to you, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for this opportunity. Alvin and Taisha, I don't know how I made the cut to be here today, but I will do my best to try to offer my insights in terms of this very important and timely topic. And I want to begin by just giving you an example. Would you pass me that book that I left over there? Just the one on top, to the right. I had the good fortune of being as a guest commissioner when they, for about a year, almost 2 years, collecting anecdotes from people around the country. And if you don't have a copy of this book, I would encourage you to read it because it captures all of the issues that I will probably be addressing today, so that not only is it coming from my personal experiences, but as a guest commissioner, but also gives you a snapshot of what has transpired historically, what is happening from a legal standpoint of view, but also what's happening, what I call is that if somebody treats you wrong, you don't have to go to the doctor to tell you how bad you felt, because you know there's a sting or there's a tinge. And it just happened to me the other day. I was in, I don't know, what city was I in? I think I might have been in Baltimore. And this female walked past me 3 or 4 times. I'm sitting there at the bar, starving, plane has been late, and she decided that she was not going to serve me. Now, I'm dressed pretty, I think I look pretty good. But she didn't serve me. I got a burr in my saddle. I'm hot. But you know, from when these things happen to you, they happen for a reason. And it reminded me of this conversation that when things happen like that to you for a reason, what was the lesson that was there? First of all, I had to get up and leave. And I went over to the restaurant next door so I could, but she would not even look at me because she knew what she did. Because when I left, we had eye contact, and I knew exactly what she was doing, and she knew exactly what she was doing. But I'm defenseless now because now I'm either hot I'm going to say something. I'm going to open up the salt shaker to leave it until when the next person goes to get some salt, that it will pour in their food. But I didn't do any of those things. I thought about some other worse things to say and do, but I didn't do it. Why am I telling you that? At the end of the day, when it comes to voting, that's how people feel when they are intimidated, or when the vote is diluted, or when there is gerrymandering. All of those components is how you feel as a voter. And when we elevate voting to a level where we are trying to make a difference and have democracy work, and everybody is supposed to be equal under the law, when you feel that way, you really have a burr in your saddle as it relates to voting. So I want you to know that serving as a guest commissioner was really a very high honor for me. And basically, our work is still not done, is what it's saying. There were 25 regional and state-based hearings between June 2013 and May 2014, covering 48 states. There's a long-standing commitment to the preservation of equal access and rights for all Americans, regardless of race or ethnic background. One of the most fundamental of these rights is voting. And basically, ladies and gentlemen, all we want to do is to be able to vote free from racial discrimination. We truly believe there's a sure foundation of the equality of all men and women before the law. But we still have race, and we just have not been able to fix this race problem in America. So whether it's at the national, state, or local level, race is a factor, and how it comes into what we deal with. And so I'm standing here center stage today on this particular moment, but I have a collective basket of memory of the things that we had to do as a people in order to get here to be able to vote. And hopefully in touching on some of those items, that I would shed some insight as to why we still have work to do. Our work is not done. But when I started this work as an NAACP president and now as the Urban League, I thought this was just a black thing. It was only black people having problems. But now, as a guest commissioner, and you start to realize it was Latinos, Native Americans, and Asians were also having similar challenges in terms of voting. But even though that we've made significant progress as a nation, it has not come without the presence of discrimination, turbulence, and disruption. People want to believe that we are we're beyond the vestiges of a bygone era. I believe, Professor, you mentioned that in terms of the Oklahoma incident, but that tells us that the bygone era is not that bygone. There's a badge of servitude that stays with you that exists, even though the slavery is over on paper. There's a badge of second-place citizenship that exists, even if sharecropping, Jim Crow, is over. There's a badge of invisibility that exists when people say that, I don't see your color, I see you as an individual. There's a couple of words I can use, but I don't think law school is appropriate to say those. We are in a colorblind and error race, and race matters is over is not the point. Even though the Governor Deval Patrick and President Barack Obama has evidence that we moved on as a society. Yes, we've made progress. So my job is really to speak to that we know firsthand that being mistreated doesn't go away easily, as I stated earlier. And not to try to be a lawyer, but I remember these things, and this is the connecting point for me. In the Dred Scott decision, it said we were not citizens. Plessy versus Ferguson said that we were to be separate and equal, and we know that they were not. Brown v. Board said that it was unconstitutional to be separate and equal. And the VRA decision was to treat African Americans equally under the law, and we have not been. We have had social and cultural nuances that deal with election administration and voting procedures that really have disenfranchised us. People have to deal with voter dilution involving electoral systems. In 2000, when the votes and the hanging chads and all of those, I was marching and protesting down in Miami, walking down to Miami City Hall, count every vote and make sure every vote counted. I was right there, one row back from the folks on the front line. And I believed in that then and now that every vote must count, and we must count every vote. So we were focusing on Florida in one election, and then they moved to Ohio to do it again. So there's always a moving target as it relates to these things. So when we think about even the gerrymandering or diminishing the voter strength of minority groups and putting them into white majority jurisdictions so those votes are reduced. So even though you want to vote for the interests of the things that you have in common, those votes don't really matter because they're diluted because of the gerrymandering or the jurisdictional differences. That's what this issue is all about. And then another way to do it, and I've run for public office. I've run 3 times, twice for city council, once for state rep. And my wife came and took the checkbook and said, you need to find another line of work. And then I came and I ran for the presidency of the NAACP, and my daughter at the time, she might have been 7 or 8, and came over and said, Daddy, you finally won something. My wife says, the next time you run for something and win, make sure it pays. So I had it on both ends. But I'm standing here today as a result of that volunteer work that the NAACP trained me on. And basically, the Urban League has given me a national platform as well as the NAACP to speak on these issues. I hope I'm connecting and making sense to folks. And so when I think about what we are trying to do is that we really are just trying to say that 55% of African Americans live in the southern states, in the southern part of the United States. So is it a surprise that Texas and Florida and Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, and South Dakota is dealing with Native Americans, that the laws and the voter ID laws are coming up in those states where there's a large percentage of African Americans? You find the Hispanics are mostly in the western part of the country and in the South and Texas as well, and the Native Americans, North Dakota, South Dakota, going towards there. So when you start to look at where these pockets, Asians are dispersed. It doesn't mean that Asians, Hispanics, Latinos, and African Americans are just in those states, but they're all over. There's a greater concentration in those states. And so when you start to see these actions that are being taken towards those votes mean that these folks will not be able to get into the voting process. So they were trying to connect, if you had a driver's license and voter registration files, they were purging voters from those files so that you would not be able to vote. That's a problem, America. The latest move, as we were saying, is to provide a government-issued photo identification. And that last contentious one is the voter-related ID. And that's the most pernicious in the last decade, this voter ID, is to disenfranchise voters. The success of the Voting Rights Act meant that in 2008 and 2012, more African Americans voted than white Americans in those last 2 elections. That was used to say that we don't need to have the pre-clearance in those states that have shown a history of discrimination. So at the end of the day, we know that these history of racial discrimination is large, is looming. You'll keep me on time in terms of where so I won't go too far over. We spent a lot of time in voter registration and turnout, but at the end of the day, when you got these systematic methods that dilute and negate African Americans from voting, you have a problem. 14% of Americans are African American. Out of the 101 cases that were successfully brought before Section 2, 101 out of 113 were dealing with African Americans. Latinos had 96 of 172 cases that were brought towards Latinos. Native Americans, I think there was about maybe, I think they only had 18 cases. But out of all of the legislators around the country, only 64 are Native Americans, only 2 at the federal level. Asian Americans, there are 11 Asian American members in Congress. And so out of all of the cases that they had, only 10 were successful. And the way that they get around it is it's about language. It's about having the voter English-only ballots, which is not news. But the fact is that those are the things that actually keep people from wanting to really same-day registration, voting more than just one day. I think, Dean, when we were talking earlier, America does everything to keep us from voting rather than to encourage us to vote. And so the challenge is that we have the conflict that we have within our nation. And I don't know why, but our conflict drives our policies, it drives the administration, it within our tribunals and police departments, our educational institutions, even in our civic discourse, race becomes a factor. So I think, if you don't believe me, that we have this insatiable appetite for conflict, then why is it that these phrases come up when these things happen? And you hear them in the streets: no justice, no peace. Black lives matter. Hold my hands up. I can't breathe. And I stated earlier, count every vote and make sure that every vote counts. These phrases come out of experiences. These phrases come out of the impact of the law. You are the individuals that are going to be responsible to make sure that as a man or as a woman, as a boy or as a girl, that I stand equally under the law. Our history has been, and has been sanctioned by the law, that we are treating people that are not being treated equally under the law. That's the challenge that we have. How do we fix it? That's hopefully what this panel will address as we go forward. Thank you for your attention.
Good afternoon. Pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, Taisha and Alvin, and everybody else who tried to put this together, and so that we can have a deep and rich conversation. We all like to tell our stories. So I think my story starts with asking, what is an aging, balding, Jewish, white guy from Beverly Hills doing at Boston College Law School talking about race? I'm not sure I can I know I can answer that. And maybe by the end of the presentation and the conversation, you can understand my particular story better. I'm very interested in, among other things, narrative. I do a lot of, myself and my team do a lot of empirical research interrogating narratives around racial inequality. And what I would like to do in the short time I have before we open it up is to throw out two ideas, two narratives, and see if I can connect them. And I hope they're going to be a little challenging, if not provocative. First is that the laws and the court decisions, I would dare say, that we're talking about today in terms of thinking about an equality recession, those were all things that were won by a social movement. People in the streets, boots in the streets, putting a lot of pressure on legislators, policymakers, police forces, etc. And we've seen the results. We've seen some awfully good results, some paradigm-changing results in the civil rights laws of the 1960s, including the Voting Rights Amendment, including fair housing and fair lending laws, including fair access to businesses and restaurants. Since the mid-1960s, however, I want to suggest that many of those challenges to the system that were won, progressive challenges that were won in the 1960s, have been worn away at the edges by, I'll put some of the blame on all of us, by lack of vigilance, by not understanding what was happening, by legislative intent, and by court challenges. And without the support, if you will, of a vibrant, active social movement, it has been relatively easy to roll back some of those gains. Second narrative I would like to suggest is that, and I hope I get myself in trouble speaking at a law school for this. Our major thinking about civil rights in the United States has really focused on the idea of equal opportunity. And we have made great, incredible strides in equalizing opportunity in educational spheres, for example. and I want to continue to use that as an example in a moment or two, in voting rights, for example. But I want to suggest that that is, at heart, a very deep and abiding liberal paradigm that doesn't get us very far at the end of the day. It's a paradigm about opportunity. And I want to suggest that while, and I don't mean to demean that, while that is incredibly important, we also need to be asking the question, does equal achievement and merit return roughly equal rewards? And the answer is profoundly no. And that I would suggest should be very disturbing. So let me go into a quick case with I won't throw off, I don't think, any more than 6 numbers. All right, so bear with me. I do a lot of work on the racial wealth gap in the United States. So there's a baseline piece of data. The typical, the median, half above and half below, white family has about $111,000 in financial assets. Everything they own that could be sold minus all their debts. The average or median African American family has about $7,000. Average Hispanic family about $8,000. Now, another way of saying that is that for every dollar of wealth that a white family has, the average African American family has about 6 cents. The average Hispanic family has about 7 cents. And that doesn't change, or that gap doesn't change a whole lot once, at least in the data, you're able to just look at families with equal achievement. Now, I've been talking about this for way too long in terms of my activist career, in terms of my research career. I want to tell you that that data has never been challenged, which I find sort of amazing. The data has never been challenged. But every single instant, the contest is about why. It's about the narrative. I have a relatively new mantra, and that is, let no fact go uninterpreted. Because somebody else is going to fill in, as we tend to do, the blank spot in our minds. So the average African American family has about 6 cents in wealth for every dollar the average white family has. I know why. And then you will hear a list, if you will, of the dominant narrative, meaning the one that is most popularly ascribed to in the society and that policy supports, will tell us it's about lack of education, it's about lack of hard work, it's about having kids before they're ready, it's about not being married. And that's putting it nicely. I make the mistake of reading reader comments on articles and blogs and things. It's not put so nicely there. All right. Let's go to the education example. In a report that we actually just released a week ago, we interrogated a narrative around equalizing rates in education. So if you take the instance of asking a piece of really good data, what if African Americans had the same rate of attaining a bachelor's degree as whites do, that is, you give them that, or give Hispanics that, or any group you want to talk about. What the data tell us is that that would add about $10,000 in wealth to the African American family. Considerable. Especially if you're remembering the median was less than 10 to begin with. And that's for college educated, college completion. Oh, no, I'm sorry. But it only changes the racial, it only closes the racial wealth gap by 1%. There's relatively little action. Right. So equalizing rates, which to me is an indicator of equalizing the opportunity. We set that aside. That's where opportunity gets us. Now ask the question, what if African American college graduates received the same financial gain as whites do from graduating college, the answer becomes very different. The answer becomes much more robust. It's about 3 times. The racial wealth gap closes for African Americans, actually more than that, about 10% versus 1% when you just close the rate. The idea here is that there is something very deep, very embedded in American society that goes far beyond equal access. And equal access is a start, a really important start, and it's a start we've not totally won yet, I would suggest, as the panel is also talking about. And we need to go beyond that to think through what is it about social policy, what is it about institutions in American culture where a black college graduate doesn't receive the same financial gains in terms of lifetime wealth as a white college graduate. It makes our job a lot more difficult. It makes the challenge a lot taller for all of us. It means, I would suggest, sticking with the equal opportunity agenda, but also now understanding what are the structures, what are the policies that lead to a highly differential financial gain for one group as opposed to another for the exact same achievement. And that's a kind of conversation and discussion that's going to take a long time to get to. It has to do, I would suggest, with student debt. It has to do with African American and students of color in general going to colleges that take a lot more burden out of their families, where the debt levels are higher. We know that. It has to do with an understanding of once people do graduate college, especially if you're a first-time college graduate in your family, you tend to be at the top of an economic pyramid and you're supporting everybody else. That's not the case in the white community. It's a different way of thinking about what does privilege look like? What are some of the taken for granted assumptions of a college graduate if you're white or if you're African American? It gets into that whole notion. All right. Lastly, to close the racial wealth gap, in my estimation, is a way of thinking about how we can get beyond what's termed for this conversation an equality recession. We clearly, in the data I look at, if you're looking at family income, if you're looking at family wealth, if you're looking at other kinds of resources that individuals and families have, we've gone back. And we've gone back in terms of black-white, white-Hispanic, white-Asian, and that is all within a larger framework of inequality increasing in the United States, probably going on 30, 35 years now. It's part of a larger set of macro issues having to do with generally wealth accumulating to the top, and within that the ways in which families of color are even, there's an intersection, families of color being even more disadvantaged. So race, equality recession has, in my estimation, has to do with a very robust understanding of the kinds of policies, the kinds of institutional dynamics that operate to create the situation that we're in. And as a good friend of mine says, hegemony is hard work. Undoing hegemony is even harder. And that's the task before us. Thank you.
Okay. Well, we are going to momentarily open the floor to questions. But I did want to just draw together a few themes that I think our panelists have highlighted for us in their comments today. You know, Dr. Wells, when you first mentioned it's important to have conversations about race, I was wondering how many people were seeing color with the word. or whether, because of the invisibleness of whiteness, right, as a race. And then when we discussed the question of your childhood story and the naturalness of whiteness in your community, I thought about the prerequisite cases that went about 100 or so years of prerequisite cases where we as a country decided that you could not have citizenship unless you could prove that you were white or not a person of color. Actually, it was more accurately that you are not a person of color because there was no definition of whiteness. And so first the courts went running over to the science because they were so certain that science would help us decide who was white and who was not white so that we could make citizens of the white folks, make non-citizens of those other unpalatable folks. And science very quickly said, you know, we can't help you. Because when you get down to it, all this whole color thing, and the court said, no worries. We will simply use the common sense rule. And that was the rule, the common sense rule, that we could determine with our own eyes who was white and who was not white. So that then, as we discussed, that was what was going in my head as we're talking about the LSATs and discussing how we talk about merit in relation to the numbers, and when you scrutinize the tests, they're asking you whether or not there should be a tennis net between the two people standing there, ultimately, still today. And then the voter ID laws, which are now cropping up so nicely, new growth in the South. And the thought occurred to me that when you get down to the numbers, which Dr. Shapiro helped us with, why that is, it is about the power of process at the end of the day, folks. It's the power of process. The people who make the rules about how the game is going to be played, and when they don't like the way the outcomes are happening, they make new rules. So it really is both heartening that we can find these things and disheartening that it's 2015 and these things are still here to be found. So on that cheery note, let me open the floor and ask if you have some questions for our wonderful panelists. Please.
Hi, my name is Roxanna Ortez. I'm 2L here, and I just want to say thank you so much for coming. I really enjoyed listening to all your perspectives.
Thank you for modeling introducing yourself. Folks? Yes. Would you all do that? Thank you.
I just had a question because when I look around this room, I see the same beautiful faces at all these types of events where we discuss race, class, and different issues. So I was just wondering if you had any suggestions from your different perspectives about how we can introduce people to, or bring them into the fold to discuss these things, because I think a lot of times people don't come because they feel like their lives aren't affected, or even so extreme that they believe that these issues don't exist. So what can we do as law students and as people who do see these issues to engage more people in these conversations?
Who wants to start?
Are these on?
They're on.
They're already on? I'll start. I think that one of the things that I think you can do, and I'll use this phrase and then you'll understand where I'm going. I often attend a lot of corporate meetings or political gatherings, whether at the federal, state, or national level, and my wife asked me, well, how was it? I say, it's always difficult when you're the only fly in a glass of milk.
Yeah.
And she immediately understands what that means. And so I think for you and your colleagues, you have to take someone out of their comfort surroundings well, they know what it's like to be the only one there, and get them to experience that, and then they will understand that these conversations are not just for you and me, if that makes sense.
I guess I want to add something. It would be nice if people who don't normally think about race in their daily life came to panels like this. I agree with you. But it also, I think that a lot of the problem, particularly among the white community, I guess I feel like I'm a spokesman for the white community here, but it is the fact that we know so little about it. And one of the things that I wanted to suggest, particularly to the white students in the audience, but to everybody, is that when I was in college, we had a reading group. It was during the Vietnam War, so there was the Vietnam War reading group. And when Black Power happened, some of us had a, quote, Black Power reading group, in which we read a lot of books that had been written by African Americans who were making the case for Black Power. I think we should have more reading groups like that. I think that it would be wonderful, especially those of you in the audience who have white friends, to enlist them into a group of that kind, because a panel doesn't really do it. You really need to think about it. You really need to talk about it yourself. I liked what you said about invisibility. Many white people feel that race is not their problem. They forget that race is not a natural category. They're reciprocal categories. There's white and there's not white, and they're reciprocal categories. And if we have a race problem in this country, it belongs to us as well as to people who aren't white. And we need to, the only way we can learn that is if we study that. And this is a school, people know how to study here. So that's what I would like to see, is a lot of people really educating themselves on this problem and becoming articulate about it. Because if you don't know anything about something, you're not likely to want to hazard an opinion. So that's what
Yes.
Hi, my name's Andrew Hale. I'm a third-year law student here. I just wanted to maybe bore down a little bit on this issue of diversity in the BC law community and the LSAT scores and things that you were talking about,
Sure.
Professor Wells. So it seems like we have all stated that we are interested in fostering a diverse community, but that the low LSAT scores of prospective students of color keeps many of them from enrolling here, from being admitted here. And we need to care about these LSAT scores because of our U.S. News and World Report ranking. And yet, I know in recent years our U.S. News and World Report ranking has been going down, and at the same time, among many students of color and others, there's this strong feeling that this community is not diverse enough. So on one hand, we're not getting the diversity that we want, and our U.S. News ranking is not where we want it. So my question is, what would it really take to genuinely foster a diverse community here? What would it take to enroll a genuinely diverse student body, and how do we get there?
Well, my suggestion is going to be a little radical, but that, I think, is the nature of the problem. There are a number of colleges, including very good colleges, Bowdoin, Wesleyan, American University, who have stopped requiring SATs. Just don't require them. You can send them if you want, but they're optional. If we adopted that as an admissions policy at this school, not only would the applicant pool get bigger, but would do great in competition with other schools that are requiring the LSAT. So what would happen to our class as a result? Well, we could supplement grade point average with interviews. We could look more closely at people's record of achievement, what they've done in their community. There are a number of things we could do. So the problem remains, how do we talk to the U.S. News and World Report? Do they want to delist us entirely because we are not requiring LSATs? I don't know what the answer to that is. But would it be so terrible if they did? Would we be making a statement that we actually would be quite happy to make? And that's really the dilemma. I say all of this knowing how much it goes against the institutional grain. And that's, when people talk about institutional racism, they're talking about something that is real and definite in this world. It does go against the grain, and I don't know that we would ever do that. but it's one thing that would make a difference. And somehow or other, just talking about it helps, because I know an awful lot of students who internalize their first-year grades thinking they're not going to be good lawyers. Let's talk about that. Let's at least, for the people we have, let's at least tell them how good they are. And that their numbers don't mean necessarily what they seem to mean.
Yes. Just to add to that little point, there are 50 dental schools in the United States of America. They decided in the first instance that they weren't going to play the game. So they are not ranked in U.S. News and World Report because they just decided we aren't doing it. But there are too many schools that get too much traction by doing it, and then everybody else goes along because they're afraid, and it works, right? So, Judge Harris.
We have a class of 84, the wonderful class. At one point, BC had a mix of that. We had LSATs, but we also had student readers. And we had what they call the core committee. And those students recruited, looked at applications, and looked for other reasons other than just the LSAT to go after students. And it was very successful. Of course, Baki came along and that went out the window. But it was successful in getting qualified students who would not have gotten into the law school. One student in particular that I remember was turned down twice by this law school. And when she finally got here, because of that core committee, became editor-in-chief of our law journal. So there was something there at one point. And I don't know if we could go back to some of that, you know, in helping. I do know that as long as we recruit, we do everything we can, but my chosen daughter wanted to come here because I went here. She ended up having to go to Georgia because she couldn't get the financial support from BC. So it's a wide, it's not just getting into the law school, it's what do we offer students once we get them. And she was a Brandeis graduate and has done extremely well. Which I wish I could have done.
Yeah, I've done okay myself, and I would not have come to BC if it had not been for the core committee and Leslie Harris actually advocating on my behalf. So, there could be some diamonds in the rough out there that y'all are missing. You had a comment. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Brian Fossey. I'm a sophomore at the Boston College undergrad, so I'm still new to most of you guys. But I'm co-director of a club on Boston College called Faces, and the main goal of Faces is challenging racism through conversation. So last night, particularly, we had a presentation to the Faces Club Blacks team, due to the fact that the Blacks team had a party called CET versus CMT. And Black entertainment television versus country music television. So the majority of the students came to the party dressed up as derogatory, stereotypical Black. So just the worst of the worst that you can think of. Put pictures on Facebook of the party. So once they were called out about like how this was an act of like prejudice and racism, they took the photos down and agreed to like have Faces come to them and present to them so they could understand why what they did was wrong. But a lot of the students never thought that what they did was wrong. And a lot of the students brought up the point that said, oh, well, Black people could be racist as well. There's movies, white chicks that they dress up as white people, all that stuff. And a lot of the students, which the Club Blacks team is all white except one Asian player, and they said that they don't think that white people are only racist, that Black people and Hispanics are racist. But then the term that Faces uses as racism is a systematic power of like repression and the systematic power that one race is on top of the system and infringes it upon the minority underneath it. So they never heard this definition. A lot of them were confused that, like, oh, so minorities didn't understand where we were coming from with that. And I just want to know where that confusion comes, or just where that, I don't want to say lack of knowledge comes, where like, yes, because you are white, you do benefit from the systematic power of racism, and you do benefit of the, I guess you could say the world, putting you on top. So I would want to understand why that a lot of white students from, I'm guessing predominantly white neighborhoods, never heard of like white privilege, never heard of stuff that like why whites are on top of this kind of power of like racism and oppression in this country.
I guess, first of all, it's terrible what happened, and I'm so sorry that it did. I do think that this is an issue that has gotten worse in the last 20 years. And I'm going to sound like an old fuddy-duddy, but I kind of blame social media. I kind of blame soundbite journalism. I kind of blame Twitter and things like that. Every thought seems to be expressible in a certain number of characters, and racism is a complicated problem. I mean, it has to do with hegemony and culture, and of course it has to do with power at the very bottom. Now that's very hard to get into a Twitter message, and I think our young people have gotten very absorbed in this sort of a new thought every minute culture, and the things about our culture that are the most complicated suffer disproportionately, and I think that's part of what happened. But that isn't to say that the other part of what's happening here isn't that it is possible to live in this country and be white and to never really understand anything about the black experience in this country. And I think we should get beyond the point where we expect black people to explain it to us. I think white people have to explain it to one another. And I know your group does good work. One of your alums is a law student here, and he's terrific, and he told me about some of the things you do, and I know how good it is. But there should be a white counterpart group that does some of the same things. And good luck to you.
Well, we have truly made discussions about race and racism taboo in our society, right? And I lay that a little bit at the well-intended feet of many, many mothers who look at their little children and they say, we're all the same, right? We're all the same. And the kids look around and they're like, we're not all the same. You know, but that's the training, and that training sort of has a silencing effect. Because a natural child will say, hey, how come you just have one leg? You know, but the mother would be like, no, don't say that. You know, don't say that. Because you're getting entrained on the things that you are not allowed to talk about. And race has fallen into that category. And people of color can sure be bigoted, but we can't be racist, right? You know, and there's a big difference between those two along the dividing line of power. So, so that's, did you want to add something? Yeah.
Let me throw in maybe a bit of a different perspective here as a sociologist, if you will, and 'cause I'm certainly not a lawyer. I think we have to understand that all of those acts, from the microaggressions to the so-called unknowing expressions, to the postings on Facebook, back to Michael Brown, back to what happens in Oklahoma, they serve a purpose. And the purpose that they serve is to make sure, or try and make sure, that there's a certain kind of boundary setting goes on. It's a threat. And it's a threat that is read not just by the people who it happens upon, but by everybody else. And I would just suggest, in the era that we have been in, not simply with drastically increasing inequality, but a stagnating standard of living for most of us, not us probably on this panel, but rhetorically those of us in American society, that trying to control or hold on to resources and whatever advantages you think you have becomes that much more important. So I actually take a little bit of a more dire view
Yeah.
of some of this. And it may well be unknowing, but perhaps the way that it goes unattended to serves that larger boundary setting, resource hoarding function.
Are there folks who would like to comment on this dialogue?
I would like to comment if I can, if you get
Yes, please, Darren.
As I stated earlier, we have this insatiable appetite for conflict. America never really deals with the actual issue, and we come up with, I call, temporary or Band-Aid responses to the issue. And all it does, it just delays or defers the actual challenge that we're confronting with, or being confronted with. So I would recommend or suggest, I don't think there's any one answer. And I agree with you, Professor, as I moderated that we can be biased or bigoted, but racist is not something, if we're using the technical definition of racism, because we are not in the institutional power of authority to demonstrate how someone else is going to be treated. We're on the other side of the ledger. But I just think that we have to look at the system of how we go about resolving conflict. And if we were to come up with ways of just dealing, because if you think about affirmative action as an example, affirmative action was a response to the riots in '68 after Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. There were riots all over this country. And so the problem or the discussion in the Beltway in Washington, we got to do something. So they came up with affirmative action. But the deal or the compromise is that we just can't deal with African Americans. So everybody was included on the spectrum in terms of how affirmative action was created. Women, Native Americans, Asian Americans, disability, everybody was added. But the issue was the riots were because of Martin Luther King. So we never really dealt with the problem. So you can go back through history and look at every incident where there was a problem. When blacks were engaged, it was a Band-Aid approach. And so therefore, we have to figure out a way, how do we deal with the issue? Frankly, talk about it. I really appreciate your presentation today, because that's squarely where it is. Some people are clueless in terms of what's going on in America. They says, you know, we had somebody says that, well, and I'm glad that you're sitting here, Tom, as a person said to me, you black people need to get over what happened in slavery. I mean, they said to me, are you kidding me? And you should, you know, because that's over. We're moved beyond that. And we asked the question, if I was Jewish, would you say that the Holocaust is over? Well, that's different. And obviously there was a little bit more intensity in the conversation, but I'm describing it here. But you get the point, is that some people are clueless as to what the pain, and my pain is no greater than your pain or your pain, but they need to at least acknowledge the pain so that we can move and make progress and not do a Band-Aid approach. That's how I would come at it.
In the back. Yep.
Hi, my name is Richard Albert. I want to thank the panelists and the moderator for this event, but also first to thank Alvin and Taisha, to re-thank you for bringing this group together. Look at everyone who's here. You have the provost here, you have Father Keenan here, the dean, Joe Quinn. I mean, this is thanks to you, so thank you to Alvin.
Get ready to do it.
So a question for the panelists, and this is inspired in part
Could
by,
you speak up a little, please?
excuse me, question for the panelists, which is inspired in part by the very important question asked by Andrew, who is no longer here. And I guess I want to ask you, invite you, urge you to go from diagnosis to solution. So what I heard from each of your presentations was a diagnosis of part of the problem. Catherine, you helped us understand the limits, perils perhaps, of standardized testing. And in response to Andrew's question, you said, well, the radical solution would be to just opt out of U.S. News and World Report rankings. I guess I'd like to invite us to think about solutions that are not radical, but that are possible. And so I want to repose Andrew's question and ask you for an answer that is possible, that is practicable. And in the same light, Mr. Williams, I wonder if you can help us think about voting. I don't interpret you as suggesting that no restrictions on voting access is the right answer, because surely we can't have no restrictions. We can't go and vote twice or 3 times. There have to be some restrictions. So I guess I want to know from you, what are
reasonable restrictions that you might accept, that would be palatable to the other side. And finally, Professor Shapiro, I appreciated your intervention, helping us understand that the right of access, one and all, on its own, solve the problem. So I guess if we can operationalize your advice with respect to affirmative action, what would it mean to say that we're going to augment the affirmative action policy to actually have some beneficial outcome that will help close the gap that you so vividly described for us? So from diagnosis to solution, help us get there, each of you.
I think
Wanna go in reverse
I think
order?
he, well, you were.
Okay, I was, all right, I do have a couple of suggestions. I had a wonderful friend who died about 15 years ago, and one of the things she used to say is, every chance you get, you talk about those damn tests, okay? And I'm saying to all of you today, every chance you get, you talk about these tests, because these tests are so powerful in creating the hegemony by which we think white people are smart. And so that's one thing that we need to talk about. It. We can't bury it under the rug. It needs to be out there in the open. I think that there is a great deal that first-year teachers in law school can do to sort of count against the racial disparities in the first year. And some of those things I do in my classes, and I'd be happy to talk about them to anybody who teaches in the first year. I do think there are things like that.
Could you give one example?
All right. One of the things that I have this was certainly true when I went to Harvard. One of the determinants in how well you did on the first year exams was how much you knew about the exams and what they were grading for. They kept it a secret, right? Nobody talked about what you were supposed to do on the exam. There were some old copies of exams that circulated, but nobody talked about what you were supposed to do. So if you wanted to do really well, you needed to be close to a faculty member, close to somebody who'd done really well or something like that. These were all very smart people, and they all worked really hard, but knowing what the expectations were was an important part of the game. So when I teach in the first year, I am so clear about the expectations I have about the final, how they're going to be graded, what the students should do, how they should prepare for them, and so forth. And I do think that that's had the effect of lessening some of the disparities in the kind of results that come about. I do think that we all need to be careful about the extent to which we keep repeating the narratives about why African Americans make less money, why they do less well on exams, why they don't. I think all of those narratives need to be corrected every time you hear them. So those are some of the less radical things I would do.
You could eliminate law school exams and do other kinds of measures of figuring out how students do, because law school exams, after all, are really favoring the faculty.
No, we grade them.
Because, yeah, you don't enjoy grading them, but you don't have to give all kinds of feedback throughout the semester. And that is actually extraordinarily unfair to the learner.
Yeah.
And it's not a model that promotes learning. So, if you really want to get off your hegemony, dump the law school exams.
Could I just say that there are a number of people who do teach in the first year who do give practice exams and sit down. I have students that come and see me rewrite their answers 4 or 5 times, getting critiqued each time. So it isn't, some of us do it, and I think it makes a difference, and more of us should do it. There's another non-radical answer.
So I'm not too old to go to law school at BC, is that what you're telling me?
No.
No, just joking. I got my quiver full. I think, first of all, thank you for your question. I think that we need to spend a lot more time nationally fixing this problem rather than having different states having different rules and regulations for voter registration. For example, when you turn 18 or 16 or 17, you get a driver's license. what is so magical about us voting on Tuesday of November 11th of every year? Why can't we vote 7 days a week? People work jobs that they can't take off to vote. So we can vote on Saturday or Sunday, even though those are sacred days, Father. But on Sunday, but in fact, people do vote, and we can vote 30 days. So we can really find different ways of registering people so that they are not limited to just one. And if we did a national, at the time you turn 18, regardless of ethnicity, race, or gender, you will be registered to vote simultaneously at the time that you turn 18. That takes all this voter nonsense stuff out the window. And so everybody is eligible to vote. If I can vote over a 30-day period, I'm good. I mean, so those are the kind of things that I think, and same-day voter registration would be another. So I can register and vote the same day. I show up, show my ID or whatever the restriction you think that's appropriate, but I don't want it to be restrictive or diluting the vote. So imagine if we can get the number of people to vote if I can register the same day and vote. If I show my address, I show a bill or something from my house that say I am this person, I can register at the same time and vote on the same day. Those are the kind of pushes that we need to move the registration system to, but it be done on a national level. I think from my perspective, that only is going to encourage democracy rather than restrict it.
I mean, after all, voter IDs are to prevent voter fraud. The actual statistics on that is you're more likely to be hit by lightning than to have voter fraud. Professor Shapiro, you have the last 30 seconds.
You're all in trouble. I stand between you and dinner, or the cocktail, whatever it is. So I would approach with two general principles, and let me give you an example. General principle one, stop the harm. Figure out where the harm is being done. And then number two, stop rewarding people for acting in racialized ways. So the example I want to use is, quote unquote, the air quotes, public education. A family that has enough earning capacity and maybe parents who give them a down payment can move, can buy a home in a relatively well-to-do, affluent community and purchase the public good of education for their child that's of much higher quality. They get rewarded for doing that. That's what they're seeking, and that's what that's their reward. And their children benefit. Arguably, they benefit as well. Let's remove that reward through state and federal policies that have much more to do with some formulas that equalize educational achievements according to the needs of a particular community. So that moving from, I live in Jamaica Plain. The history in Jamaica Plain is if you have one child, you can afford private schools, and you send your kid away to the Milton Academies of the world, like my son. If you have two kids, you move to the suburbs, because that's the price point. And the calculation is really quite like that. We have to take away that price point. We have to take away the idea that if you move out of Boston, just using the local example, to the Wellesleys or whatever of the world, I don't mean to pick on Wellesley, that you're going to be rewarded for that. Fine if you can buy the home in Wellesley, but that should not allow you to buy into a higher quality public school system. And that's, I think, a very profound sort of public issue.
In the United States of America, the average white child has $7,000 a year spent on their education. The average black child has $700 a year spent on their education. So that's the numbers. So you want to talk about equal opportunity. If you are not going to share, or you believe in a meritocracy and you believe that there are deserving and undeserving, and the undeserving are systematically continued to be put in a position of not deserving, we all lose. We all lose. And that's something that we all have the power to affect. So thank you, everybody, for taking time out for today's conference. Thank you to our panel. Thank you, Dean.
Thank you.
Oh, are you going to stay for dinner?
Yes, I am.
Oh, good.
My
Are
wife.
you going to stay for dinner? I am staying for
It's in
dinner.
here, makes sense. You can't-
I have to run home. But I'm so glad.